Let's get started. I am Kate LeMay. This is my dog Phoenix. I use pronouns she, her. Welcome. I'm the acting senior historian at the National Portrait Gallery and the interim director of Portal, which is our scholarly center. Thank you so much for joining us for today's program, Oak Flat, a fight for sacred land in the American West with author Lauren Redniss, which will be presented by Lauren Redniss, who is an artist, an author, MacArthur Fellow, and associate professor at the Parsons School of Design. Sharyl Pahe-Short, Visitor Services Manager at Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian, will moderate tonight's Q&A. Before we begin, we'd like to give a land acknowledgement. Although we are tuning in together today from different places, we gratefully acknowledge the Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands we gather, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home in these places today. We also recognize the inherent flaws of portraiture. Since this nation's founding, who is represented and how one is represented reflects the country's flaws as well as its strengths. The National Portrait Gallery strives to present a more complete narrative, one that acknowledges the history of slavery, racism, and inequality in the United States. We are so pleased to present today's event as part of the Greenberg-Steinhauser Forum in American Portraiture. The National Portrait Gallery acknowledges the recent passing of Daniel B. Greenberg, whose generosity and that of his wife, Susan, makes the Greenberg-Steinhauser Forum in American Portraiture possible. Okay, so a bit of ground guidelines for this Zoom format. Like I was saying earlier, please use the chat function. Let us know from where you are watching. You can also use it to make comments and connections to your own ideas as you listen. We highly encourage sharing. You should use the Q&A feature, which is different from the chat. So go ahead and familiarize yourself with the controls. If you want to ask a question for Cheryl to pose to Lauren, you must use the Q&A feature. So you can submit your questions during the presentation and it'll be asked afterwards if you'd like, or you can submit your questions during the Q&A as things get rolling and as your mind starts kind of digesting everything. That's totally fine. So I will now introduce our guests. Lauren Redniss is an artist, author, and a MacArthur Foundation Fellow. Her book, Thunder and Lightning, Whether Past, Present, Future, won the 2016 Penn E.O. Wilson Literary Science Writing Award. Radioactive, Marie and Pierre Curie, A Tale of Love and Fallout, was a finalist for the National Book Award for Nonfiction. Her most recent book is Oak Flat, A Fight for Sacred Land in the American West. She has been a Guggenheim Fellow, a fellow at the New York Public Library's Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers, the New America Foundation, and an artist in residence at the American Museum of Natural History. And she teaches at the Parsons School of Design in New York City. Sharyl Pahe-Short is the Visitor Services Manager in the Office of Museum and Learning Programs at the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C. and New York. As a member of the Navajo and San Carlos Apache tribes, Pahe-Short oversees the policy development, management, and oversight of a variety of services and programs that enhance the visitor experience at the museum. Pahe-Short joined the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian in 2004 as a cultural interpreter in the education unit. As a museum educator with over 20 years of experience in interpretation and educational programs, Cheryl has dedicated most of her career working to raise the public's level of appreciation and understanding of Native people today. Pahe-Short has a BA in photography from Arizona State University in Tempe, Arizona. Okay, so now let us turn to the presentation itself. Without further ado, please welcome Lauren.
Thank you so much, Kate. I'm so delighted to be with you all today. Many thanks, Kate, and also to Jackie Petito and to Sharyl Pahe-Short, and for all of you for joining from so many different places. I also just want to shout out my friend Sandra Rampler, who I believe is here from San Carlos, and I think I saw John Welch in the chat. So yeah, so let me just, okay. Sorry, getting oriented. I'm speaking to you today from Lenape-Hoking, the home of the Lenape people, also referred to as New York City. And I will just share my screen right now, if this works. Okay. Can everyone see that?
Yes, it's beautiful.
Okay, excellent. So I'm eager to talk with you about my book, Oak Flat, the situation it examines, and the role of portraiture within the book. First, though, because my work is a little bit unconventional, I've found that it's helpful if I give you a little context about the way I work and why. I've written, as Kate mentioned, several visual nonfiction books. They're not graphic novels, they're not children's books. I report and research and write the book like any journalist would. I create the book's artwork. I design the layouts, and often I design a typeface for the book. My goal is to achieve effects that I don't feel I'm able to achieve with either prose narrative or images alone. I'm searching for some ineffable third thing that emerges in the friction between these forms. The combining of text and image is often perceived as unusual in the realm of nonfiction. But one of the reasons I'm really glad to be with you here today, hosted by two Smithsonian institutions, is because I think this approach is actually quite intuitive to museum curators and museum visitors. We go to museums to see art and artifacts, materials that carry a force beyond words. Wall text and catalog essays provide context and add additional layers of meaning. In museums like the National Museum of the American Indian and the National Portrait Gallery, we rely on this combination of visual materials and accompanying texts to immerse us in stories of the past, to stir our imaginations, to make arguments. I'll briefly share a couple examples of how I've approached storytelling in past projects. And I think these examples highlight meaningful differences with Oak Flat, which is my most recent book. My first book was a biography of the last living Ziegfeld girl, a woman named Doris Eaton Travis, who lived to be 106 years old. I'm sure many of you are familiar. The Ziegfeld Follies were early 20th century Broadway spectaculars, very cutting edge for their day. In remarkable ways, Doris's life intersected with the tides of history and its important players. So readers are witness to 2 world wars, the rise and fall of the Soviet Union, the Great Depression, the women's movement, the golden age of cinema, the dawn of television, the upheavals of the 1960s and 1970s, and so on. My thought was, this one woman's extraordinary life could act as a window onto American life in the 20th century. And through her story, we see the twists and turns of global forces playing out on an intimate scale. Doris gave me access to her vast archives of newspaper clippings, photographs, letters, diaries, and I integrated this documentary evidence into my own drawings to reconstruct and reimagine scenes that had not been captured on film. I was trying to create some sort of surreal, recovered memory fever dream, which I thought reflected the spirit of my subject, Doris, and her world. Within the collages, the portraits you see of Doris are always photographic. Because I had all of this wonderful period material, I chose not to draw her. So here you see Doris in the foreground, and it's her two sisters that you see in the middle of the image as black swans. In a different book about the physicists Marie and Pierre Curie, I made the artwork as cyanotype prints. In this case, I was making images using a chemical process that relied on invisible rays, the ultraviolet rays of the sun, as a nod to the radioactive forces the Curies studied. When I depicted the Curies themselves, I was not creating portraits in a conventional sense. I wasn't especially concerned with creating a likeness. Marie Curie and Pierre Curie are well-known, widely documented historical figures. It's very easy to do a Google search and find photos of them. So my interest here was really to suggest a certain atmosphere, the romance and the mystery of these scientists exploring new realms of knowledge. I'll show you just one last project before we get to Oak Flat. In the fall of 2019, just before the pandemic, New York City Ballet called me with an open-ended commission to create work that would fill this space in their theater at Lincoln Center. It's become a winter tradition for the company. I was the 8th artist that's been asked. In the past, artists have, for example, filled the room with balloons or sculptures. These are by the artist Dustin Yellen. Oh, whoops. Something got deleted. Thanks. Oh, okay. I thought about what I wanted to do, and I decided to interview and draw people who work behind the scenes at the theater and to create larger than life-size portraits. As Kate suggested earlier, portraiture has traditionally celebrated the rich and the powerful. Throughout history, portraiture has served as a mechanism to assert power or to reinforce it. I wanted to invert this tradition and celebrate the people who are generally invisible to the public and who rarely receive recognition for their labor and their creativity. I wanted to honor the ushers, the security guards, the workers in the call center and the mailroom, the piano tuner, the company hairdresser, the archivist, the people who clean the bathrooms and change the light bulbs. Oral histories from my interviews were included as wall text. I wanted each person to be clearly recognizable to themselves and their colleagues. I appreciate the trust that it took for participants to share their stories and to agree to be depicted in a public portrait. Ideally for me, the process of creating a portrait is a kind of collaboration. This is Head of Security, Captain Clem Mitchum. I also did portraits of 3 of Captain Mitchum's sons who work as stagehands. One afternoon, just as the last portrait was installed, I was up on the 3rd floor and I saw Captain Mitchum walk in across the room. And I watched him walk slowly around every tier, looking at every face. And as he approached his own portrait, I went up to him. He paused, he turned to me, and he said, "I'm much more handsome than that." Oak Flat, A Fight for Sacred Land in the American West, covers a situation that is still unfolding. It's a book about a place and the people connected to that place. At stake is Apache religious freedom, native sovereignty, as well as the ecological and economic welfare of a region. In addition to the reporting, I wanted the visual choices in this book to reflect the seriousness of these facts. In both form and content, the book needed to feel urgent. I did many of the drawings on location using the simplest possible materials, just colored pencil on paper. Oak Flat is about 60 miles east of Phoenix, Arizona. The United States says Oak Flat is public land, part of the Tonto National Forest. But to the Western Apache, who are indigenous to the area, Oak Flat is part of their traditional homeland. It is unceded treaty land, and it is holy ground. If you visit Oak Flat, called Chichil Bildagotil in Apache, you can climb on the volcanic rocks. You can sit under old growth trees. You might see a bobcat or a bear wander through the site. When it's 120 degrees in Phoenix, you can find refuge here in the natural waterways, in the shade and the breeze. At Oak Flat, there are ancient petroglyphs. You can see evidence of different types of dwellings. Pottery shards have been found. Archaeologist John Welch has called the area the best set of Apache archaeological sites ever documented. In the past, Oak Flat was an Apache burial ground, and it continues to be a place where Apache people come to gather important foodstuffs and medicinal plants. The centuries-old emery oak trees here are rare in the region's desert landscape. Apache families hold important religious ceremonies at Oak Flat, including a coming-of-age rite for girls called the Sunrise Dance. I'm not Native. I don't presume to speak for Native people. I spend time with people, I listen to their stories, and I relay them in as faithful and precise a way as I can. The details that I relate in the book about Apache religious ceremonies, and in particular the sunrise ceremony, were shared with me by women and girls who narrated memories of their own dances. During the 4 days of the sunrise dance, a girl who has recently begun menstruating symbolically reenacts the Apache creation story. The girl is said to enter the spirit world and possess the supernatural powers of the Apache Mother Earth figure, who's known as the White Painted Woman. She's required to run and dance for hours. It's a test of physical and spiritual fortitude. The ceremony is central to Apache community and culture. Oak Flat is not the only place where Apache sunrise ceremonies are held, but the site holds a unique significance. Here you see Apache spirit dancers who embody supernatural beings called the Gon. According to Apache leaders, Oak Flat is the home of the Gon. Through the Gon, Oak Flat is a direct corridor to Yusen, the creator. In other words, the religious practices that take place at Oak Flat cannot simply be relocated. In 1995, the largest known untapped copper deposit in North America was discovered beneath Oak Flat. The minerals in the deposit, based on today's price of copper, are valued at approximately $140 billion. The discovery of the copper triggered a race to get these minerals. Two of the world's largest mining corporations, London-based Rio Tinto and Melbourne, Australia-based BHP, teamed up to create a subsidiary company called Resolution Copper to access the ore. Resolution Copper's plan is to remove the minerals through a process called block caving. Block caving removes underground rock, causing subsidence of the ground surface. If the mine moves forward, Oak Flat would collapse into a vast subsidence crater, 2 miles wide and 1,000 feet deep. Because Oak Flat has been considered by the United States to be public land, national forest, Resolution Copper needed Congress to pass legislation to access the ore deposit. For a decade, lobbyists and politicians tried to make this happen. They failed because of pushback from Native activists joined by mining reformers and environmentalists. The current chairman of the San Carlos Apache tribe, Terry Rambler, has compared Oak Flat to Mount Sinai and to the Vatican, these sacred sites that no one would imagine digging up and turning into an industrial wasteland. But the United States has a long record of treating Native sacred sites differently than the holy ground of other religious faiths. After a decade of failed attempts to get standalone bill in favor of this mine passed, in 2014, then Senator John McCain added text designed to transfer Oak Flat to Resolution Copper as a rider to that year's National Defense Authorization Act. As I'm sure many of you are aware, riders are sometimes used to shoehorn controversial legislation into large appropriation bills. McCain's rider was buried hundreds of pages into this massive military spending bill that included, for instance, the entire budget of the Pentagon. The rider was added just before midnight on the night the bill came up, just before it came up for vote the next day. The bill passed, and a few days later, President Obama signed it into law. So this legislation, Section 3003 of the 2015 National Defense Authorization Act, states that the US will give Resolution Copper the land with the ore in exchange for miscellaneous land parcels that Resolution Copper has bought up elsewhere around Arizona, which you see here. As I mentioned, the copper ore has an estimated market value of over $140 billion. The market value of the land parcels up for exchange have been appraised at about $7 million. In other words, the value of the copper that would go to a private foreign company is 19,000 times greater than that of the lands the American people would receive in exchange. In economic terms, this is a raw deal. But Apache opponents of the mine don't focus on this financial discrepancy because to the Apache, there is no monetary value that can be placed on Oak Flat. There remains some logistical hoops that the mining has to jump through to finalize the land transfer. I'm going to get a little into the weeds here, but stick with me. I think this will help clarify the current status of the project. Before the land transfer can take place, the Forest Service has to publish an environmental impact statement. Because of the way the legislation was written, this environmental impact statement is close to a formality. Its findings do not bear on the outcome of the project. The mere fact of its publication triggers a 60-day countdown within which time the government is required to hand over the land. In its very last days, the Trump administration did in fact publish this quote unquote environmental review, triggering the clock. But after Biden was inaugurated, his administration rescinded the publication, leaving things in a state of limbo. So opponents are using this time to pose a legal challenge, which is currently in front of the Ninth Circuit. A decision is expected in that case, probably within the next 2 to 8 months. There's also a potential legislative challenge in the form of the Save Oak Flat bills, which have been introduced in both the House and the Senate. These efforts are far from sure bets. Oak Flat remains extremely vulnerable. The effort to extract resources at the expense of native sovereignty is a story as old, indeed older than the United States itself. It's important to place the struggle for Oak Flat within other timescales, beginning with the history of Anglo-European conquest, in which we see the Oak Flat conflict as a 21st century update of an old story, with copper standing in for the gold that brought conquistadors to the Americas 600 years ago. There are parallels with more recent history. In 1830, Congress passed the so-called Indian Removal Act, which forced 80,000 indigenous people off land in the Southeast where they had lived for time immemorial and pushed them onto largely unmapped territory in what is now Kansas and Oklahoma. This too was a land exchange. The US took possession of the traditional territories of the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Seminole, and Chickasaw peoples and offered them vastly inferior lands to which they had no connection. A motivating force behind the Indian Removal Act was capitalism, the drive to exploit land for profit. The legislation was sought by Southern farmers who wanted to build plantations, and the effort was supported by Wall Street investors who had international backing from Europe. So 200 years ago, we see an almost uncanny parallel of what is unfolding today at Oak Flat. And more recently still, I'm sure many of you have been involved with or followed the efforts against the Dakota Access Pipeline, Line 3, or the fight for Bears Ears, Mount Graham, Mauna Kea, the Black Hills, to name just a few ongoing land rights battles. The United States would not exist without the seizure of native land. Here we see that the story is not just history, it's current events. At the center of all of these struggles are people whose culture and future are intimately tied to the land. Portraiture doesn't have to mean simply a headshot. Portraits can be painted in words as vividly as they are in images. In my work, I've tried to do both by depicting the people whose stories I tell, both through visual art and by presenting their words in their own voices. Oral history is central to virtually all of my work. As much as I'm interested in portraying what someone looks like, I want to convey the tone and texture of their voice, their ideas, their memories. My book, Oak Flat, is a multi-generational saga. It tells the story of two families. First, the Nosie family. The Nosies are an Apache family who are leaders in the fight to protect Oak Flat. I know I don't need to remind this audience of the many harmful and cliched depictions of Native Americans in American popular culture. As a non-Native artist representing Native people, I try to tread lightly and with humility. In Oak Flat, my drawings of people are realistic and representational. It was critical to me that each portrait feel like a singular individual of flesh and blood. Here you see Wensler Nosie, the former tribal chairman of the San Carlos Apache tribe. This is Wensler's wife, Teresa Nosie. Teresa grew up on the Navajo reservation north of San Carlos. Today she works for the IRS. Together, Wensler and Teresa run a newspaper called the Apache Messenger. They have 6 daughters, a son, and 15 grandchildren. Nolan Pike is the eldest grandchild. Nolan first testified before Congress against the proposed Resolution Copper Mine when she was 14 years old. Nolan, along with 2 of her younger sisters, talk about the importance of Oak Flat for Apache cultural survival. Wensler spoke to me about his parents, Paul and Alvira. Paul Nosie held odd jobs. Wensler remembers him in particular working at an asbestos mine on the edge of San Carlos. Alvira raised 7 children. When she died in 2016 at 88 years old, Alvira left 47 grandchildren, 124 great-grandchildren, and 30 great-great-grandchildren. The San Carlos Apache tribal leadership has officially denounced the proposed copper mine. But as you'd expect in a community of 15,000, opinion is not uniform. There are tribal members who support and even work for Resolution Copper. I interviewed San Carlos Apache tribal member Mike Beatom, who has been employed by Resolution Copper since 2010. Beatom is the company's Native Affairs coordinator. He runs training sessions, gives tours, and narrates videos that promote the mine. Beatom takes something of a, if you can't beat him, join him approach. He sees the mine as an inevitability, and he just wants a seat at the table. The book also follows a mining family from Superior, Arizona, the small town close to the site of this proposed mine and close to Oak Flat. In recent decades, Superior has become nearly a ghost town. Half the town's population left after the last mine closed. Some residents believe that a new mine offers a lifeline. The Gorhams have lived in Superior since the late 19th century. Their patriarch, Patrick Gorham, was the town's first sheriff. Gorham and his wife Molly had 11 children. At the time, there were no elected officials in town. Sheriff Gorham's daughter, Patricia, told me, Daddy made up the law and he enforced it. This meant, for instance, if a minor was thrown in jail for fighting or for visiting one of Superior's 3 brothels, Sheriff Gorham made sure the man was released before his shift at the mine the next day. Mike McKee, Sheriff Gorham's grandson, worked in the open pit of the nearby Ray copper mine for 24 years. When he was diagnosed with leukemia, Mike assumed it was the result of all those years working with petroleum and other chemicals at the mine. Amazingly, he wasn't angry. He told me, everything in the world causes cancer. In the mine, you are making $21 an hour, plus the insurance. I don't regret it one bit. Almost all the Gorhams worked in Superior's last mine, either underground or at the smelter where the ore was processed. Jackie Gorham told me about working underground in a world that could be totally devoid of light. He talked about getting disoriented and lost and the terror that would set in. In addition to the portraits in the book, the other types of images are landscapes. Arguably, the landscapes are portraiture. The book's main character is a place. A crucial moment in the Apache sunrise ceremony is marked by an act of painting. Toward the end of the ceremony, the sunrise girl is covered with a thick paste called glesh. In Apache tradition, when the glesh is spread on the girl's skin, she begins her transformation into the Apache Mother Earth figure, the white painted woman. As Nolan Pike told me, in our creation story, the white painted woman comes out of the earth. When she emerged, she was covered in ashes. When you're painted with glesh, you become the white painted woman. I'm struck by the beauty and profundity of this idea as it relates to the question of portraiture that we've been looking at today. The ingredients for the glesh, water, sand, pollen, have been gathered by the medicine man and his assistants at the ceremonial site. The paint is made of the soil, the plants, and the waters of Oak Flat. The paint is the land itself. We might be tempted to characterize the spreading of the glesh as a portrait or even a double portrait. The sunrise girl is painted, the white painted woman is incarnated. It seems more true to say that this sacred act dissolves any distinction between portrait and landscape, between the land and the Apache people who inhabit it. In March 2020, Nolan Pike again gave congressional testimony against the Resolution copper mine. She referred to Oak Flat by its name in Apache. Chichil Bil Dagotil is my home, she said. It is who I am. In 1883, the federal government's Code of Indian Offenses criminalized Native religion. The law stated, quote, the sun dance, the scalp dance, the war dance, and all other so-called feasts shall be considered Indian offenses. These feasts or dances are intended and calculated to stimulate warlike passions. The result is the demoralization of the young who are incited to the wicked conduct of their elders. Until the Indian Reorganization Act passed in 1934, Native people caught performing religious rites could be imprisoned, their food rations withheld. The effort by the United States government to restrict Indigenous religious practice was inseparable from the goal of undermining tribal sovereignty and usurping Native land. Collectively held land and the very idea of sacred land were impediments to expansion and economic exploitation. A girl who has her sunrise dance at Oak Flat takes her place in a long history. She's conscious of the generations of women before her whose ceremonies were held here, often in secret. Nalin told me, when you're painted, you're like frozen. I was dancing, but my eyes were closed because I didn't want to get the paint in them. When the girl's eyes are covered, she's a girl. When the godmother wipes the paint, the girl opens her eyes. She's not looking at the world she looked at before her dance. She's looking at a new world. Thank you.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Again, my name is Sharyl Pahe-Short. I'm the Visitor Services Manager at the National Museum of the American Indian in our DC location and our New York location. As introduced earlier, I'm originally from Arizona. I come from the Navajo and San Carlos Apache nations, and I have been working and living here in this area for over 16 years. So I'm really happy and really excited to ask any of your questions, and also I have a few of my own that will go along the main topics that have been discussed throughout this book, which was very exciting and very lovely to read. So I'm going to answer mine a little bit first, and then I'm going to go ahead and answer, kind of go back and forth with all of you in the chat. Again, I encourage your questions, and I will be looking at them as we go along. So one thing I did want to say is that myself, originally from the area, I did grow up a little bit more on my mother's side in the Navajo culture. And in knowing about these topics and in knowing about what it is that you expressed in the book, Lauren, is that I know these are things that are talked about in all nations, in all Indigenous communities. In other words, that this continued fight, this continued struggle of telling our stories in a way that really helps us enact a lot of the things that in any Indigenous community across the United States, across the Western Hemisphere that we are dealing with today. I think I found it, I know I found it really interesting in the book that there was this weaving, there was this way in which story was told. And the one thing that I can really relate to is that in many of our communities is that creation stories, oral tradition is really prominent. And I know you said this throughout your presentation. And that weaving was really helpful for myself in seeing that there was this balance between looking at Native people, and there was also this balance of looking at other people and seeing where they stand. One of the first questions that I had was looking at, from those different perspectives, did you find it challenging at all to get all of those perspectives? Because I know when I read it, and especially some of us that see the cover of it, the first thing we might think of is, oh, Lauren's going to be just all about, the San Carlos, it's about Oak Flat, and there's going to be a really firm stance on it. But as you go through it with the lovely drawings and with all of the stories that are told back and forth, I didn't really find it that way for myself. And of course, I'm a little biased in knowing about a lot of what is going on in Indian country. I found it interesting that you had a really nice balance. But I also wanted to, again, ask that question of what made it most challenging for you, or not, in kind of telling all these stories?
I think, what I hope to do is, I definitely have a point of view, but I try not to be didactic in my point of view, because I think it's not the most compelling way to convince other people. In the end, actually, I think if you present, the facts on the ground in the voices of people and invite your reader in to engage and to care, I think, and give readers the space to make up their own mind, I think that actually people get more invested and feel just that people are able to come to their own conclusions and then believe their own conclusions because they did arrive at them themselves. And I feel like that's actually just a more compelling way to yeah, to convey the story and to convey the facts.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I really find that, especially myself, working for the National Museum of the American Indian, our biggest thing that we do is that we do create this awareness. We understand that people are coming from different levels and perspectives, and whether you're native or non-native, there is never this assumption that everyone understands what's going on or knows these things, and we are there to support and to help. So I really appreciate that the book really lends itself to that, so people can make their own decisions. Another thing I wanted to ask is that in looking at this moving forward, just like I mentioned at NMAI, we have this huge awareness, especially for all the indigenous peoples of the Americas that we represent. And for a lot of us in that representation is that this awareness leads people to act. Is there something in particular that you want people to lead towards as they read this book or kind of move forward afterward?
Well, if people feel compelled to get involved, I would encourage them. The Apache Stronghold has a really great comprehensive website with all kinds of resources, articles, all the latest news, the different legal filings, and also phone numbers, addresses, people to write to, representatives. And so, yeah, that I think is a really great comprehensive resource to dive in. I can come up with a whole other list of resources. That's a good way to start, as if Oak Flat is the kind of entry point.
Okay, great. I am going to look at the chat here, and it looks, let's see, I have from Chase Clow. What originally drew you to this invaluable project, and how long did you conduct the research?
Thank you. Yeah, so I first read an op-ed, just a short op-ed in the New York Times. It was, I think it was early mid 2015. And I had actually started another book, a different book. And as soon as I read the op-ed, I was like, oh, I'm scrapping that. I think I know what I'm going to write about. And so I ended up just, Windsor Nosey wasn't mentioned in that op-ed, but I just dug around and I found out about him, and I cold called him. I talked to Teresa on the phone. I talked to Wensler. We started communicating, and then I said, I'd like to come out and visit you. This was maybe August 2015. And so I ended up going out to Oak Flat and meeting Wensler, and we just drove around in his truck for several days. And, we just talked all about his family, the region, history, religion, all about Oak Flat, but also all about the small towns and the ghost towns and the economics. And yeah, so that was my first visit, and then just built from there.
Okay. I wanted to also go in another way of also looking at the book. And of course, the Portrait Museum, our wonderful host here today, is that when we think about portraiture, many people have different avenues that they go into. And one of the quotes that you said earlier in this presentation is, landscape is portraiture. Can you go a little bit more into that? I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, I guess, maybe you can probably speak to this better. I mean, I think the close ties in the more than that, the inseparable connection Native people have to the land. I think that's what I was trying to evoke in thinking about that. I remember, like, you hear cliches like home is where the heart is and things like that. Or, I think in a kind of non-Native American culture, there's like a sense of people, just of movement, constant movement and shifting. And I think that's something that's really different in Native culture. And yeah, so I was trying to get to that idea. And I just wanted to tack one thing onto that previous question about like the origin of the book. There's another aspect that was really compelling to me, and that is copper itself. And Cheryl, you suggested this or alluded to this when you talked about the creation stories, and the book goes back into the geology of the copper and the very formation of the earth and the formation of copper within the earth. And so one of the things that's particularly interesting about copper as a mineral is that it's very important to modern life, to information technology, our cell phones. This Zoom call wouldn't be happening without high-speed internet and copper, and clean energy, wind and solar all depend on copper. So it's really interested in the complexity of how we are all implicated in this push and pull between this kind of drive for resources and dependence on the resources, but then what's at stake and at what cost. So I was interested in trying to navigate that through the book.
Great. Another thing, again, still kind of staying along this same line, you mentioned earlier that you did a lot of the drawings that were in the book, which I thought were beautiful. Again, I'm a little biased. I do have an art degree as well. And I thought that was a really nice way of telling story. And especially, like you just mentioned before, the book really starts out with this idea of creation, which a lot of us as Indigenous people do in our own way. And that weaving in from the story of whether you showed an image of just Blackness I thought that was also really strong with just some of the type lettering that was in there. I thought that really helped with the mood of all the things that you were drawing and going along. It made me think, though, a little bit further about when you talked with some of the people that were in your book. How was that process for whether it was you were drawing at that very moment and hearing them speak as you were taking notes maybe, or was it like you took a photograph from them later and then you drew their portrait, or even the landscape itself? I'm just curious in my own way of how that process was for you.
Yeah, so I sort of do all of the above is maybe the shorthand answer, and the more detailed answer is I used to try to interview someone and draw them at the same time, and found that was a really fast way to compromise both the drawing and the interview. So I now separate those two processes, and I try to just really focus. And if I'm talking to someone, I'm just totally engaged and looking someone in the eye when we're talking. And then if they have time, I will sit and draw them from life. That's definitely my preference. It's a really wonderful way to draw, but that's not always an option. So I do take photographs, and that's actually also great. My background was always drawing from life, but I feel like I can sort of pull from that experience even now when I'm drawing from a photograph, because I have done that for so long. And similarly with an environment or a landscape, I will combine drawing from life. Obviously, a mountain is a great subject. It's gonna be very patient if you want to draw it, so you can sit there for as long as you want, depending on the weather. And but then I like to also have the reference material, so I can build more complex compositions, or just have that to refer to later. Now, I also write a lot of notes, because sometimes a photograph isn't able to capture maybe the quality of light or the full kind of grandeur or panorama that you experience, when you're on site somewhere.
Going off that question, someone asked, which I can see Patricia asked on their behalf, a little technical difficulty. They are asking is, how did the people who you depict in the book feel about having their portraits drawn in the context of the book?
Thank you for that. Yeah, it's funny. I mean, when I draw someone and include them in this way, in a similar way that, like when with the Lincoln Center project, in a way, that's my only audience. When I draw that portrait, I'm so conscious of that dynamic of how is that person going to feel when they open the book, and it means I scrap a lot of drawings. Sometimes I might like a drawing, but I feel like that doesn't honor the person in the way that feels kind of most generous to their kind of collaboration with me, or their participation in the project. And I want to always honor their sharing of their story and their time, and just really, feel like each person is will not regret talking to me. So yeah, and I in a previous version of this talk, I actually have a photograph of Wensler and I looking at the book together when I brought it to him and Vanessa, his daughter, and before the book was published. And I sat with him going through it page by page, just kind of holding my breath. And yeah, it's always a kind of daunting moment. But yeah, that's very important to me to really honor that collaboration.
Yeah, it's interesting that you just said that, because we did just get a question where someone asked, did the Native people involved, were they able to read the book before you finished it, or like you said, before publishing it?
Yeah, that was really intense. I brought it, and I remember like Vanessa going through the book, and it was so sweet the way she reacted, because she saw the drawings of her daughters, or like, because she's the mother of Nalan and Nijoni and Baze, who are the three girls in that, that I showed. And she was like seeing them, because time had elapsed since since we had been doing those interviews and I did those drawings. It's a long process to have a book published usually. So she was like, oh, they look so young. They're so cute. She just was like such a mom in that moment. And she called up the girls and she's like, they want copies. And it was just like really wonderful moment. But yes, that was important to me to share that with them before publication.
Another thing in looking at your book is that there was a lot of things that I thought were just interesting. Of course, there's this correlation between the people, the land, and people, I say broadly, Native and non-Native, throughout the book, because I think it's a really interesting concept in telling story, that you do get all those perspectives, because we're definitely really big about this at the American Indian Museum, seeing both sides of why parties acted the way they did and did what they did. So I found it interesting that a lot of the little nuggets that you put in there were about, for me, for example, I had no idea how much copper was used in the technology that it is today, such as through the cell phone usage that I know many of us have today, or whether it be in the looking at the environment moving forward, like solar and wind and etc. I thought that was interesting, because most people usually see a story where it's, again, one-sided, the cover of the book. And I think with those little nuggets that are kind of captured throughout, it really helped enliven the story to kind of go in the direction that it did. And going back on this concept of oral history and telling these stories, is that a common thread that you have with a lot of your books? And of course, what you just mentioned earlier in the beginning of the presentation, things that you are working on now. Is that kind of your thread that you see going through a lot of your books that you write, oral history or anything such?
Yeah, I think there are a number of reasons I think I'm drawn to oral history. I think in like the other ideas that you evoke there, I'm most interested in complicated stories, right? Stories that have a lot of layers and complexity and different tensions. And then also have in which the layers or the different kind of parts of the story interact in unexpected ways. Like you talked about the black, right? So black is a really important symbolic color in this book. And it connects to the black of outer space in the solar system, which comes up right at the beginning with the formation of copper, but then comes up later in what you and I were talking about yesterday, this astronomical institute that's built on another sacred site, which is a whole other complicated story involving the Vatican and aliens and all sorts of things. So, but also a certain mineral that's found in Superior and has a kind of like supernatural suggested power, and also the darkness of the underground world of the mining tunnels. So there are all of these different ways where there are kind of metaphorical layers that connect and weave the different stories together. So I think as I approach a project, I'm interested in ambiguity, complexity, high stakes, interesting people who with long history. So there are multiple generations of these two families, at least three or four generations each, whose lives kind of unfold. And yeah, so you can kind of hopefully get invested in these different people.
Okay, we have a few questions here. Will you be exploring other Native topics in future books?
Yeah, I think there's a new project that I want to work on that does address indigeneity and native land in a different area. Yes. Great.
And I think you mentioned this earlier. What's your current project that you're working on? I guess just to reiterate that again.
Yeah. Well, I have a few. I have. There are two projects that I'm working on that I'm not totally ready to share all the details of yet. Those are sort of my two big next nonfiction, adult books. And then I have a children's book that's coming out in April that's called Time Capsule, and that's about who gets to write history, which is sort of a grandiose way of talking about it, but it is a very simple story, actually.
Okay. Another question here is, in your research, were you able to connect with companies and people involved in the construction plans of the mines? Was there interest on your part to connect with that side of the story, despite your focus on the Apache voice?
Yeah, absolutely. So I did tour the mine, but Rio Tinto just utterly stonewalled me. Rio Tinto is the majority owner parent company of Resolution Copper, and they wouldn't get on the phone. They wouldn't answer. I emailed them lists of questions over and over again. They refused to answer. And then when they heard the book was coming out, they immediately emailed me and said, "Oh, could you send us a copy?" So they were, I would say, not cooperative.
Okay. This one's a good one from my good friend that I work with, Elaine Silversmith. Which Native American writers or artists inspire you?
Oh, wow. Well, Vine Deloria is, I think a giant. Gene O'Brien, the Ojibwe historian who wrote First Thing and Lasting. I think that's a absolutely seminal work. With Walter Eckhart, the legal scholar, has written a number of really, really excellent books about Supreme Court decisions. David Troyer. Oh gosh, I could go on and on. Yeah.
Yes, definitely. All Native authors and publishers we know very well at NMAI. And then our final question that we have time here for, looking in the chat. Can you share anything about your publishing process? Did you face any challenges throughout the process in writing this book?
Yeah. Yeah, I was discouraged from writing about Native Americans. It is the truth. Which I thought was, as soon as I got that pushback, I thought, now I really have to pursue this because yeah. And I think that moment may have changed. And I think, the kind of political and publishing landscape has pretty, changed over the upheavals of the last several years. But yeah, that definitely happened.
Well, that is all the time we have for our questions. This was a lovely conversation of questions and Q&A we had with each other. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I thoroughly enjoyed reading the book, and thank you for answering them.
Thank you so
turn
much.
it back over to Kate.
Wow, that was amazing. I really, what a pleasure to hear someone like Lauren, speak about their work and their process. And I'm, I've known Lauren now for a couple of years, and when I first read Oak Flat, just the first chapter, it kind of like took me into another zone. It was so relaxing and beautiful. but also intriguing. And you know, anyways, I just really appreciate your work, Lauren. And I feel, you know, we had so many comments in the chat from people who were similarly inspired and just really grateful, you know, for this opportunity to hear you share. So thank you, Lauren. And I also want to thank Cheryl, who is an amazing colleague, whose work at NMAI is so important. And we're just truly, you know, we're sort of part of a special family, I think, at Smithsonian. So thank you both so much. Thank you, everyone, for coming in to Zoom with us, wherever you are. And look for our next Zoom, our next lecture from Portal. It'll be in late January. We're just firming up the details. Jackie and I are taking a break until then, which is kind of nice. So I hope everyone has a good evening, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.